Dedicating this to the great Dr. Raza, though I do not have any personal interactions with him, but the stories that I've heard about him, especially when he breathed this last, there was a lot of discussion, and I believe he was a great man. Pradeep has already shown some of the Charcots yesterday to some of you. But we call it a foot attack, isn't it? A foot attack. The foot is red in the initial stages. The foot is all red, inflamed, warm. It is painful. So it looks like an infection. It looks like a cellulitis. It looks like an osteomyelitis. The patient is a diabetic, and we suspect that it is possibly infected. But this is an aseptic foot attack, which is going to kill this foot unless we recognize the condition and treat it aggressively. What is the cause of these Charcots? There are a number of other reasons, but for our practical purposes, we're going to concentrate on diabetes, which is the leading cause of Charcot's foot and ankle problem. You'll be surprised to know that it happens only in 3% of diabetics, but the duration of the disease does not matter. Majority of these patients develop Charcots in the first decade. Why? We don't know. Male and females are equally affected. It does not matter whether the diabetes is insulin dependent or insulin independent, does not matter. It does not sometimes depend on the severity of the disease. So sometimes we see diabetics which have been controlled reasonably well still go on to develop Charcots. So it's an enigma still. Obviously with increasing age and increasing weight, the risk is higher. Now remember that vascular compromise in a diabetic because of atherosclerosis or ischemic limb problem is protective. If a patient has a less circulation in the limb, is unlikely to develop a Charcot. So Charcot is a problem of hypercirculation. And if a patient of diabetes has developed Charcots, has a higher mortality rate in the coming years compared to a diabetic patient who has not developed a Charcots. So all of these things tell us that Charcots is a difficult problem. It's a process where the bones have become already soft bones because of diabetes, because of age, there's a severe osteoporosis, and leads to a destructive skeletal process where the bones and joints of the foot and ankle start to fragment under body weight, and they can create dislocations, destructive process of all the bones in the foot and ankle. It is obviously associated with neuropathy. Fracture and dislocations can happen, and resultant deformity can be progressive, and structural stability of the foot is lost. Why this happens? It's a neurotraumatic versus a neurovascular hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis. What is the neurotraumatic hypothesis says is that there is no protective sensation, there is a neuropathy, there is a cumulative trauma, and the patient does not realize that there is a cumulative trauma happening over a period of time, or repetitive trauma, or a stress fracture if a patient has walked more. Patient does not realize, continues to walk, and that cumulative trauma leads to a destructive process of the soft bones. Because of the lack of protective sensation. The other hypothesis is a neurovascular hypothesis or a neurotropic hypothesis where, because of the neuropathy, there is a loss of vasomotor control. So excessive vasodilatation in the limb leads to hyperperfusion. And that hyperperfusion kind of washes out a lot of strength from the bone, proteins, calciums, and everything. It's kind of an autosympathectomy, maybe, we don't know. These are all hypotheses. In a normal patient who has a trauma, this cycle of trauma and acute phase reactants is limited somewhere by normal protective mechanisms. There is a break in the cycle, and it does not go round and round. But in a diabetic with a neuropathy, this protective mechanism somewhere which breaks the cycle is lost. So trauma leads to accumulation of inflammatory markers, inflammatory mediators, leads to osteolysis. Osteolysis is a more trauma. So that process goes on continuously, leads to fragmentation of the bone. Whatever happens, clinical assessment, in the initial stage, you will see that the limb is warm, there's a neuropathy, all the features of inflammations are there. There is no vascular compromise. Most of the times you feel full bounding dorsalis pedis and posterior tibial pulses in these patients. Pain is a characteristic feature in the initial phases when the process starts. And later on, sometimes the patients do not have pain. Again, that's in contradiction to what we said, that the patient does not have pain, and that is why accumulative stresses lead to more bone destruction. Goes to show that we still do not know what exactly causes it. Differential diagnosis in the acute phase is from cellulitis, infection, osteomyelitis, abscesses. Because this looks like an infection, and many situations when the patients come to us, they have already been subjected to broad spectrum antibiotics. Some of them have been admitted, given IV antibiotics, and they have not responded and then have been referred. In spite of the fact that the inflammatory markers, the leukocyte counts are normal, these patients are subjected to broad spectrum heavy antibiotics, which they do not need and does more damage than harm. Other differential diagnosis will be stress fracture and a condition called diabetic osteolysis, which is again an obscure condition, but that's one of the factors. To differentiate between these, so how do you differentiate? If a diabetic patient comes with a foot swelling, looks like a cellulitis, the best way is to just do an elevation test. We ask the patient to elevate the foot on 3 pillows for a couple of hours, and you see the swelling goes drastically down by 50%. Ask the patient to elevate, tell him to go home and elevate the foot at night on 3 pillows and come back in the morning, and you will see the swelling is drastically gone down, the redness has gone down within a few hours of elevation. Is the simplest test. There will be situations when these patients will present to you and you will still not be able to say whether it is infected or not, because Charcot's and infection can coexist. Especially if the patient has developed an ulceration, then the question of whether this Charcot's also has an infection becomes difficult to answer. And then sometimes you have to resort to scans. But unfortunately, in diabetic Charcot's, if you do an MRI scan, most of the times the MRI will not be able to differentiate whether the bones are Charcot's affected or infection affected. It becomes a problem. If there is a collection, it's easy. So you do an ultrasound or an MRI show you a soft tissue collection, well, you are likely to have an infective process. Bone scans alone are useless because again, there's a hypervascular process. It will light up everything. Bone scans are not that good. In some centers, if we have the facility, then combining an indium-labeled leukocyte scan or with a technetium scan, the two scans together giving you a picture can differentiate acute Charcot's in the bones from osteomyelitis and other infections. But again, there is no substitute for good clinical judgment when you want to differentiate Charcot's from infection. The X-rays can look like this, and possibly you'll end up saying, yeah, this is all infected, but it's not. It looks like an infection, and it becomes difficult to differentiate from other causes, whether it is Charcot's, just diabetic osteolysis, or osteomyelitis. Now, depending on the X-rays and the clinical presentation, there is a staging which dictates the treatment. Stage 1, when the process has started, it is all fragmented. The bones are all showing fragmentation, no new bone formation. Clinically, it is red, hot, and swollen. That is the stage 1, when it has just started. Stage 2 is the swelling starts to go down, the redness starts to go down, but it is still there. But the X-ray shows that there is some new bone formation beginning to happen here and there. It has a good potential to heal, although the time to heal is long in terms of bone healing because of the circulation, but the potential to healing is there. So good new bone formation will be seen, but this is a stage where there is no consolidation. That stage comes when you see very good callus formation, and that is the stage 3. So acute inflammatory process, you see debris, bone debris, fragmentation, PCs, fractures, dislocations, everything is seen in stage 1 in the acute process. Stage 2, you see decrease of the clinical symptoms and sclerosis of the bone hand, and that's example of type 3 when there is significant callus formation and almost consolidation has happened and the swelling has gone down, and arthrodesis of these things of the affected bones and joints has happened. Now that is depending on the progress of the disease. Depending on the area of the foot which is involved, Charcot's is classified into 3 or 5 types, 2 classifications, starting from the forefoot going on to the hind foot. Type 1 is midfoot. There is other classification which starts in the forefoot. So forefoot is 1, midfoot is 2, hind foot is 3, and ankle is 4, and 5 is involving the the calcaneal tuberosity. So starting from the distal to the proximal. The commonest is the midfoot. There is dislocation of the arches, TMT joints, talonavicular joints, and then it is in the hind foot when it involves the transverse tarsal and the subtalar joints. It can create a rocker bottom deformity. And ulcers can form because of the dislocated talar head which has gone into the plantar surface of the skin and can cause a breakdown. A shorter classification 1 to 3 and a longer classification 1 to 5. So this we are following 1 to 3. Ankle, and when it involves the heel is 3B, when it involves the ankle it is 3A. Worse outcomes, so commonest is the midfoot, but more difficult to control is the ankle because ankle is a main weight-bearing joint. The treatment is almost always non-surgical. Remember that. The purpose of the treatment was to take the patient from stage 1 to stage 3 without significant deformity, without dislocations, subluxations, which may happen, but they happen in a way that it does not create a bad deformity. Taking the patient from a stage of acute inflammation to a stage of consolidation without any intervention is the mainstay of treatment if you diagnose them early. If they come to you late, already deformed, then it's a different issue. But if you diagnose it early, it's almost always non-surgical, taking the patient through the various stages. And how do you do that is total contact cast initially, then in the acute phase, then go on to the AFO. So some music with the talk is always good. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. So initial stage is the total contact cast, acute phase. After about 2 months, 3 months, stage of consolidation starting. Go on to the AFO, consolidation completed, go on to custom shoes and orthotics. So progress through that. Total contact cast in stage 0 and 1. There are rules to apply the TCC. We must follow the rules, otherwise we'll cause more damage. So it has to be changed every week when the swelling goes down, and it has to be well padded over the bony prominences. In the initial phase of acute Charcot's, preferably non-weight bearing, and as the consolidation progresses, start to gradually increase the weight bearing. Literature does not support, a lot of people are using these things, but there is no scientific evidence that any of these things help in the Charcot's process. In the stage when the consolidation has happened, you may have to give customized footwears or Charcot restrained crow walker, that is called Charcot restrained orthotic walker, to control the deformity and help the patient walk without tilting his foot or ankle. And a long-term crow walker and orthotic support will be required in majority of the patients. There can be an aftermath. Now, the surgical treatment of Charcot's is directed towards only the residual part if it is not controlled by braces. In the end, when you have reached the end stage of treatment, everything is consolidated, or if the patient has come to you early with a deformity which is not braceable, or an exostosis which is threatening to cause an ulcer, or already an ulcer is developed. So that is the first surgery that we do, is an exostectomy. The second is the realignment or the fusion if there is a deformity, and then obviously if it has been ulcerated at the site of deformity or prominence, then a debridement. I'll not go into the details of each of these. We know there are some principles. Arthrodesis is difficult to achieve. It has a propensity to good bone formation, but it takes a very long time for it to consolidate. Some of the examples of arthrodesis, really bad, threatening to go into amputation. A blade plate done very, very long time ago, but survived somehow. A recent patient with a transfibular approach in a TTC. So if you have an ankle, hind foot, then a TTC fusion nail is a treatment of choice, consolidated, did well. Uncontrolled diabetic, 28-year-old male with that deformity, the talus getting absorbed there. Advised surgery, he went off, did not want to be fused, came back with complete loss of the talus body 6 weeks down the line. This was a time when we did not have the TTC fusion nails in the country. I think it was about 9 years ago. We did a transfibular approach, used the lateral fibula into the site where the talus should have been and put a distal medial tibial plate onto the lateral side. Now you have special TTC fusion plates also. Nailing is better, but if you do not have a nail or do not have an experience to do a nail, then a lateral plate through a transfibular approach is a viable option. So obviously this will require longer duration of non-weight bearing. This healed well and he started to walk. We went very slow, 6 months not weight bearing. He came back one day and he had this fracture. At this maybe a stress fracture, he denied having injured himself. The fusion had consolidated. So we thought it's an undisplaced fracture. 6 months of cast immobilization was done. After that, it seemed to be healing. We were not confident. We removed the cast, asked him to put a boot and walk, and do not walk on the boot still. And he said he could not restrain it. He started to walk and then came back one day. And that is when the patient comes back like you, that's the Monday mood for work you feel. That kind of patient, Charcot's, difficult fusions, you enter the OT and everybody is scared of you. That is how the patient came back. The leg is started to bend. The fracture had not healed, and this was about a year down the fresh fracture. We had a nail by that time. We could not remove the plate in the operation theater, so this is what we did. Fortunately for us, so somebody corrected, my assistant corrected the deformity manually and put a medial plate. United well, and this patient is still doing okay, but that's fortunate. I do not call it a technique of expertise, because ideal would have been removal of the plate and a nail, but fortunately it united. So another example, a nail, again a TTC nail. Another example of a pan-talar involvement, pan-talar fusion with this and also healed nicely. Another example of a TTC fusion. An example of a has been already tried twice, I think, in this patient. Fusion with a synthesis. This is a gives you a better purchase, that spiral blade, but it's difficult to put. A common mistake. I'll just finish here. There's a number of cases, but common mistake while doing a TTC nail is going onto the medial side distally, because the calcaneus is not under the tibia. Generally, the calcaneus is normally at a slightly valgus angle. So this nail was put somewhere like this. So be careful.